I have told this story maybe 100 times, to my own children, to strangers in the tavern who wouldn't believe a word of it, to the young ones who work the toll road now and think the old lantern keeper has finally lost his mind. But I was there. I saw it with these eyes, and these eyes were young then, sharp. I did not imagine it. So let me tell you what happened the night the king stopped his carriage, and why nothing in the Vale of Thornmere was ever the same after. You have to understand the cold first. If you don't understand the cold, none of the rest of it will land right. That winter, the year they later called the White Winter, the one the old folks measured everything against for the rest of their lives, the cold came early and it came wrong. Not the honest, biting cold of the mountains that you can dress against. This was a wet, seeping cold that got into the marrow. It froze the river solid by the second week of the frost month, froze it so hard that men walked their oxen across it. I saw a bird drop out of the sky one morning, just fall, stiff as a stone, dead before it hit the road. I was 14. I kept the lanterns at the North Toll Gate, where the road out of the low country climbed up toward Ravenscourt, the castle that sat on the black hill above us like a crow that had decided to become a mountain. That was his castle, the king's. We did not say his name out loud back then. You didn't. Not because it was forbidden, exactly, but because saying it felt like knocking on a door you did not want opened. Everyone in the Vale knew what he was. Everyone knew, and no one talked about it, the way you don't talk about the thing under the ice you can see moving. King Valen Corriveau, the sovereign of Ravenscourt, the last of a bloodline older than the kingdom itself. A vampire, a true one, not the story kind, the real kind. My grandmother used to say he had ruled the Vale for 300 years and would rule it for 300 more, and that we should be glad of it, because a lord who does not age is a lord who does not need to squeeze the peasants for coin to buy his son a crown. She said that. She also crossed herself whenever his carriage passed. People are complicated people are complicated. We could be grateful and terrified of the same man in the same breath. I only ever saw him from a distance in those days. A tall figure at the far end of a procession. A pale hand at a window. Once, at the harvest fair when I was small, I saw him standing on the castle balcony watching the fires below, and I remember thinking he looked lonely up there, and then my mother yanked me by the collar for staring. He did not come down among us. That was the rule of things. He stayed up on his black hill, and we stayed down in the Vale, and the toll road ran between the two worlds like a stitch holding a wound half closed. That's how it was. That's how it had always been. Until the night the widow came. I remember the night began quiet. Too quiet, the way it goes right before the worst weather. The wind had died down completely, which sounds like mercy but isn't. When the wind stops in a hard frost, it means the true cold is coming, the killing kind, the still and starless kind. I had the brazier going in the little gatehouse. Old Bracken, the toll master, was asleep in his chair with his mouth open, snoring like a saw through wet wood. My job was to keep the lanterns lit along the gate wall and wake him if anyone came through wanting passage. Almost nobody came through at that hour, in that cold. Only fools and the desperate travel at night in the frost month. She was both, I think, a fool and desperate. Most people are when they've run out of choices. I heard her before I saw her. A small sound out in the dark beyond the lantern light, not footsteps, more like a dragging. A slow, uneven scuffing on the frozen road. I stood up. I lifted my lantern and went to the edge of the light. And there she was. A woman coming up the road out of the dark. She was wrapped in a shawl that was nowhere near enough, a thin, gray thing, threadbare, the kind you'd use to dust furniture, not to survive a night that could kill a healthy ox. She had it pulled over her head and knotted at her chest, and inside the knot, pressed against her body, was a bundle. No, not a bundle. A baby, wrapped so tight only its face showed, and its face was the wrong color, a gray-white, waxy. and clinging to her skirt, stumbling along beside her, half carried and half dragged, was a second child. A little girl, maybe 5 years old, with no shoes. No shoes by. Her bare feet were black at the toes. I have seen a lot of hard things in a long life. I have buried a wife and 2 sons. But I don't think anything ever stopped my heart the way that little girl's bare black feet did on that frozen road. I ran to them. "Mrs.," I said, "Mrs., you can't be out here, you'll die out here." She looked at me, and I want you to understand she wasn't looking at me the way a person looks at another person. She was past that. Her eyes had gone to that flat, calm place people go to right at the end when the cold stops hurting and starts feeling like sleep. She was smiling a little, a gentle, faraway smile. "We're almost there," she said. Her voice was slurred and thick. "Almost to my sister's in the next village. It's just over the hill." There was no next village over that hill. Over that hill was the King's Road, and then the King's Hill, and then Ravenscourt. Her sister, if she had one, was a lie the cold had told her to keep her walking. "There's no village up there, Mrs.," I said. "Come inside. Come to the fire, please, just for a." "We can't stop," she said, still smiling. "If we stop, we don't get up again. I know that. I'm not stupid." And she gave a small laugh, and the laugh frightened me more than anything because it was so calm. "I just have to keep them walking. Keep the little ones walking." The little girl at her skirt wasn't walking anymore. She had stopped. She was just standing there, swaying, her eyes half shut. And the baby in the knot of the shawl hadn't made a sound the whole time. Babies that cold don't cry. Did you know that? A crying baby is a fighting baby. Silence is what you're afraid of. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran back and I shook old Bracken awake. "There's a woman on the road," I said. "Her and 2 little ones. They're dying, Bracken. They're dying right now. We have to." Bracken came awake slow and cross, the way old men do. He heaved himself up and came to the door and looked out at her, and his face changed. He wasn't a cruel man, but he was a careful one, and careful men have learned the hard way where the edges of their kindness are. "We can't take them in," he said quietly so she wouldn't hear. "What, why not?" "Boy, look at that baby. Look at the little one's feet." His voice was gentle now, and that gentleness was the worst part. "Those 2 aren't going to see morning, maybe not the mother either. If they die in the gatehouse on the King's Toll on the King's Road, do you understand what that brings down on us? Questions, his men, his accounting." He shook his head. "I'm sorry, I am, but I've got my own family down the valley. I can't have the King's men looking at me over 3 frozen paupers. Give her a heel of bread and send her on. That's a mercy in itself. I want to tell you I fought him harder. I was 14. Bracken was the toll master and my mother's cousin and the man who fed me. I fought him a little, not enough. And while I stood there arguing with a grown man about whether it was allowed to save 3 human lives, the wind picked back up. That was the cold coming, the real cold, the killing kind. The woman had started walking again. Away from us, up the road, into the dark, toward a village that did not exist, with a dead baby maybe already in her arms and a barefoot girl trailing behind her. And she was still smiling that gentle smile, and I remember I opened my mouth to shout after her. And that's when we heard the horses. You could always tell the King's carriage by the horses. Nobody else in the Vale had horses like that. 6 of them, black as the space between stars, and they didn't sound like ordinary horses on the road. Ordinary horses clatter and stamp. These moved almost silent, this soft, heavy drumming, like a heartbeat you felt in the ground before you heard it in the air. Bracken went white. He grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise. "Get to the gate," he hissed. "Toll position. Don't look at the carriage. Don't speak unless the driver speaks to you. Do you understand me, boy? Do not." But I wasn't listening, because the carriage was already there. It came out of the dark so fast and so quiet it was on top of us before Bracken finished his sentence. 6 black horses, a carriage the color of old blood, tall and narrow, with silver at the corners that caught the lantern light like teeth. A driver up top wrapped head to foot in black, no face showing, just a pale sliver of chin. And it was slowing. The carriage was slowing down. Bracken made a sound I had never heard a grown man make, a small, wet sound of pure fear, because the king's carriage did not slow at the toll gate. The king's carriage did not pay tolls. It swept through always at speed, and you got out of its way and you thanked whatever God you had that it hadn't stopped. It was stopping. The horses came to a halt maybe 20 feet from where the widow stood swaying in the middle of the road. She had turned to look at it. In her state, I don't think she even understood what she was seeing. To her, it was probably just a warm shape and a light in a very cold dark. For a long moment nothing happened. The horses breathed steam. The driver sat like a statue. The wind hissed across the frozen fields. Then the carriage door opened. I have tried so many times over the years to describe him to people who never saw him, and I always fail, because the truth is he did not look like a monster. That's the thing nobody tells you. That's the thing that unmakes all the stories. He stepped down from the carriage and he was just a man. A tall man in a long dark coat, no crown, no fangs bared, no red eyes glowing in the dark. His face was pale, very pale, paler than the moon on the snow, and it was a still face, a face that had stopped being surprised by anything a very long time ago. His hair was dark and pulled back. He moved with a kind of slow economy, like he had learned across 300 years that there was never any reason to hurry, because he was always going to outlast whatever he was hurrying toward. His eyes found the woman, then the girl, then the bundle at her chest. And something moved across that still, ancient face. Just for a second, I was close enough to see it. It was not hunger. I know what people expect me to say. They expect me to say his eyes lit up with hunger, that he saw 3 helpless bloods on his road and licked his lips. That is not what I saw. What I saw was a man look at a suffering he recognized, a very old, very tired recognition. He walked toward her. His boots made almost no sound on the frozen road. The widow watched him come with that same faraway smile, past all fear now. "You are on my road," he said. His voice, I still hear it, low and quiet and strangely soft, not the voice you'd give a monster. A voice used to being obeyed without ever needing to be raised. The woman blinked at him slowly. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "We're going to my sister's just over the hill. We're almost." "There is no village over that hill," he said. And God, this broke me by, she nodded. She nodded, still smiling, and a single tear ran down her frozen cheek and I watched it stop halfway, actually freeze on her skin. "I know," she whispered. "I know there isn't, I couldn't stop walking. If I stopped I'd have to lie down, and if I lie down with them her voice cracked. I didn't want to lie down in a ditch, not with the little ones. I wanted us to still be walking when it came. I wanted us to be trying." The king stood very still. I have thought about that sentence every day of my life since. I wanted us to still be walking when it came. A mother's whole heart in it. She had accepted death. She was too far gone not to, but she would not accept surrender. She would carry her children toward a lie of safety until the very last step, so that when the end came it found them moving, hoping, alive in the only way that mattered. The king reached out, slowly, and with one pale finger he tilted the shawl back from the baby's face. The whole road held its breath. "This child is not dead," he said. The woman's knees went out from under her. She didn't fall, he caught her. He caught all 3 of them, really, one arm around the mother, the baby still pressed to her chest, and he crouched and gathered the little barefoot girl up against his other side. And I remember how strange it looked. This pale, immortal thing kneeling in the road in the killing cold with 2 children and a fainting woman in his arms, like some dark painting of a saint that had gotten all its meanings tangled. "Driver," he said not loudly, "the brazier." The wrapped figure was down off the carriage before I understood what was happening, and moving toward Bracken's gatehouse with a purpose that made old Bracken flatten himself against the wall. "Boy," the king said. It took me a moment to understand he meant me. His eyes had found mine across the road. Up close they were very dark and very old, and there was a kind of exhausted patience in them. "Why, yes, my lord," I managed. "You have a fire inside. It is small, but it is warm." It wasn't a question. He knew exactly what was in that gatehouse. He probably knew what was in every building in his vale. "Bring the little one to it. Her feet must be warmed slowly. Slowly, do you hear me? Not close to the flame. Warm water if you have it, no hotter than blood. If you warm frozen flesh too fast, you kill it. Go." I took the little girl from his arm. She weighed nothing. She weighed like a bird, like a bundle of sticks in a wet dress, and her bare black feet knocked against my legs, and I nearly wept. I carried her inside. I did exactly what he said. Warm water, not hot, slow. She started to whimper as the feeling came back into her. A good sound. A fighting sound. And I remember thinking that whimper was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. And the whole time, through the open door, I watched the king of Ravenscourt kneel in the road and hold a dying widow and her baby against his chest to keep them warm with a body that had no warmth of its own to give. Here is a thing I did not understand until I was much older. He had nothing to give her, do you see? A vampire is cold. His body is the temperature of the room, the temperature of the grave. He could not warm her the way a living man could. When he pulled that woman against his chest, he was not sharing his heat. He had no heat. He was blocking the wind. That's all he could do. That's all his 300 years and his black castle and his immortal blood could do against a plain winter night. He could put his own body between a freezing woman and the wind, the way any of us would, the way the poorest peasant in the vale would, and it was enough, barely, to buy the minutes that mattered. The oldest, most powerful thing in that whole country, kneeling in a ditch to be a windbreak, because that was the only help that was actually his to give. I think about that more than anything else. The driver had the brazier roaring. Between the two of them they got the mother and the baby into the gatehouse. Bracken had gone completely useless, pressed into a corner muttering, but the king ignored him entirely. He laid the woman down near the fire, not on top of it, the same careful distance. And he took the baby from her arms with a gentleness that did not match anything I thought I knew about him. The baby was alive, barely. Its little chest fluttered. The king held it in his two pale hands, this scrap of life, and he looked down at it with an expression I could not read. "It needs to feed," he said. "The mother is too weak. Is there milk in this valley at this hour? Goat, anything?" Bracken found his voice cracked and shaking. The Hensley farm down the valley. They've a nanny goat still in milk, kept warm in the house. Driver. The wrapped figure was gone into the dark before he finished, and I heard one of the black horses cut loose from its team and gallop off down the valley, and I thought, those horses could reach the Hensley farm and be back before a normal horse cleared the gate. Then it was just us, the king, the dying family, old Bracken shaking in the corner, and me. The little girl, warm now, feeling coming back to her ruined feet, started to cry properly, big, hiccuping, exhausted child sobs. And she did a thing that I will never forget as long as I live. She reached out for the king. She didn't know what he was. She was 5 and she was hurt, and there was a tall grown-up nearby who smelled like cold rain and old libraries, and she reached out her little arms to be picked up and held, the way any hurt child reaches for the nearest safe-seeming adult. And the king of Ravenscourt, the terror of the vale, the thing under the ice, went very, very still. I watched him look at those small, reaching arms like they were the strangest thing he had encountered in 3 centuries. Which, maybe, they were. When is the last time anyone reached for him? When had any living creature in that valley ever moved toward him instead of away? Slowly, so slowly, Like a man handling something he was sure he'd break, he reached down and he picked her up. He held her against his shoulder. She buried her wet face in his cold collar and cried herself out, and he stood there in the firelight holding her, one pale hand supporting her back, not moving, barely breathing, staring at the wall over her head with an expression I did not have the years yet to understand. Now I understand it fine. It was the face of a man who had spent 300 years being feared, and had forgotten, completely, deep in his bones had forgotten, what it felt like to be needed by something that wasn't afraid. The goat's milk came. The driver was back within minutes, and they warmed it and fed the baby drop by drop from a cloth, the king's own hands doing it, patient as stone, and the baby drank and its color came up from gray toward pink, and somewhere in the middle of it the widow woke. She woke, and the first thing she saw was the king of Ravenscourt feeding her baby by the fire. She screamed. Of course she screamed. She thought, what would you think? You collapse dying in the snow with your children, and you wake to find him holding your infant. She screamed and she lunged and she tried to snatch the baby back, and she was so weak she barely got upright. The king did not flinch. He held the baby steady. He waited for her to exhaust herself, which took only a moment, and then he said, in that low, quiet voice, "He is feeding. He is warm. If I meant your children harm, madam, I would not have had to work this hard for it." The plain, dark sense of it stopped her. She stared at him. She looked at the baby, pink now, drinking, and at her little girl, asleep and warm in a blanket by the fire, and at the roaring brazier, and at this pale, terrible creature who had, by every account she'd ever heard, should have drained all three of them dry in the road. "Why," she whispered, "why would you?" And the king was quiet for a long moment. "Because you were still walking," he said at last. She didn't understand. I didn't fully understand it then either. "You were dying," he went on, still looking at the baby in his hands, not at her. "You knew you were dying, and you kept walking toward a village you knew was not there because you would not let the end find your children lying down." He was quiet again. "I have watched this valley for a very long time, madam. I have seen a great many people meet death. Most beg, most bargain, most curse. Almost none of them keep walking." He lifted his eyes to her, and they were terrible and gentle at once. "I found I did not wish to let the cold have someone who kept walking. That is all. There is no deeper reason. Do not look for one." Part 1 continues. Part 2 picks up here. The widow's name is Elowen. She and the children are taken up to Ravenscourt to recover, against every law and custom of the Vale, the valley's fear and gossip, the little girl who is not afraid of him, the slow, careful, entirely unromantic yet deepening bond, the reason the king has been so alone. And the night the Vale's frightened elders come to the castle gates demanding he give the humans back, forcing him to choose openly, for the first time in 300 years, whose side he is on. By that's roughly tilde 400 words, honest count, no padding. Ye Part 1 Ka opening arc high, hook plus setup plus tension plus first climax beat, clean or emotional, tier niche rules key hisab c, dignified widow, no coercion, tasteful. Fresh elements used, koi tracker repeat nahai. Kingdom place, Thornmere/Ravenscourt nay. King, Valen Corvo widow, Elowen narrator, old lantern keeper witness frame. Set up, White Winter, freezing road toll gate. Bata de. Part 2 continue Karan Issy voice main. Climax right arrow resolution right arrow ending line. Taki full 89k target key pause pahunch. Yakoi tone tweak, Zayada dark Gothic, Yazayada soft emotional. Part 2 resumed narrative arc with established characters, and thematic tensions resumed narrative arc with established characters, and thematic tensions. A widow was freezing with her children. Then the vampire king stopped his carriage. Part 2. Where I left off, the widow was awake by the fire, and the king had just told her not to look for a deeper reason than the one he'd given. She looked anyway, People always do. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me slow down. Because what happened after that night is the part nobody believes, and it's the part that matters most. Her name was Eloan. I should have said that sooner. In all the years I've told this, I sometimes forget to give her a name as if she were just the widow, just the woman on the road. But she was Eloan. She had a name and a life before the cold tried to take it, and I owe her the name. The children were Bram the baby and Wren, the little girl with the ruined feet. I learned all this later in bits over the strange months that followed. That night, the king made a decision that broke 300 years of law in the Vale. He took them up the hill. You have to understand what that meant. No one went up to Ravenscourt, not the living anyway. The castle on the Black Hill was where he lived and we did not, and that was the whole arrangement, the whole delicate piece of the place. People did not go up, and people certainly were not carried up, warm and breathing, into his household to stay. But that's what he did. When the milk had done its work and the baby's color had come up and the little girl slept and Eloan could barely keep her eyes open, the king simply said, "They cannot stay here. This gatehouse will be cold again by morning and the child needs weeks of care, not one night." And he lifted the sleeping girl, and he told the driver to carry the mother and the baby, and he walked back to the carriage with them as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Old Bracken finally found his courage, or his fear found its voice, same thing. "My lord," he stammered, "my lord, you can't, the people, if word gets out that you've taken humans into the castle, they'll think." "They will think what they think," the king said, not even turning around. "They have thought it for 300 years. It has never once been accurate. I have stopped trying to correct it." And he got into the carriage, and the black horses turned, and they carried a widow and her 2 children up the road to the castle that everyone in the valley was afraid of. I watched the lanterns of the carriage climb the Black Hill until they disappeared through the gate. Then I stood there in the cold a long time, holding a wet blanket, not knowing that I had just watched the first night of the end of the old world. Word got out by noon the next day. Of course it did. Bracken couldn't hold his tongue, and neither could I, honestly, though I told it differently than he did. He told it frightened. I told it amazed. Both tellings spread. And the valley went strange. Some people were afraid in the ordinary way. They said the king had finally acquired a taste for something, that he was keeping the woman and children as, I won't repeat the ugliest of it. Livestock was the polite version. They said we'd never see the 3 of them again. But others, and this surprised me, others were quiet in a different way, thoughtful. My grandmother was one of them. When I told her the whole thing, breathless, expecting her to cross herself, she just sat with her hands in her lap for a while. 300 years, she said finally. 300 years on that hill, and he's never once come down for anything but to pass through. And now he comes down in the killing cold and gets on his knees in a ditch for a pauper widow and 2 babies that aren't worth a copper to him. She shook her head slowly. "Boy, that's not a monster. I don't know what that is, but it's not a monster." She wasn't the only one thinking it. All through that hard winter, in the tavern and at the well and in the market, people turned it over. It didn't fit. The story they'd been told their whole lives, the thing under the ice, the terror on the hill, didn't fit the man who'd stopped his carriage. People don't like it when the story doesn't fit. Some of them wanted to force it back into shape. Others started to wonder, quietly, if the shape had been wrong all along. That crack, that little crack of doubt running through the whole valley, that's what everything else grew out of. I only know what happened inside the castle that winter because Eloan told me, years later, when we were both old, when she'd come to sit with me at the same gatehouse where it started. So this part is hers, told in her words as near as I can remember them. She said she was terrified the first weeks. Of course she was. She'd wake in a soft, warm bed in a great cold stone room and remember where she was, and her heart would try to climb out of her throat. She kept the children close. She barely slept. She kept waiting for the price. Nothing in her life had ever been free, and this warmth, food, a physician for Wren's feet, milk for the baby, a roof against the worst winter in living memory. This was so far past free that it had to be a trap. She spent those first weeks waiting for the trap to close. It never did. The king, she said, mostly left them alone. He was not a warm host. He didn't hover, didn't perform kindness, didn't ask for gratitude. He simply saw that they had what they needed and otherwise kept to himself, up in the high parts of the castle where the old books were. She'd go days without seeing him. When she did see him, it was brief and quiet. He'd ask after the children's health in that low, flat voice, listen to the answer, nod, and go. He was the loneliest thing I ever saw, she told me. I stopped being afraid of him the day I understood that. You can't stay afraid of something that lonely. It's like being afraid of an empty house. The one who changed everything was Wren. Wren was 5, and 5-year-olds do not hold the fears of the valley in their hearts. She healed. The physician saved all but 2 of her toes, which was a miracle by itself. And as she healed, she got bored, the way healing children do, and a bored child in a castle goes exploring. And she kept finding the king. She'd toddle into the library where he sat with his books, and she'd climb up next to him and ask what he was reading. She'd bring him things, a pretty stone, a feather, a drawing she'd scratched on a slate. She was not afraid of his cold hands or his pale face. To her, he was just the tall, quiet man who lived in the big house, and children love a tall, quiet man who lets them sit near him. Eloin said she used to panic those first times, come running to fetch her daughter away from him. And every time she came running, she'd find the same picture. The ancient king of Ravenscourt sitting very still, holding whatever small treasure the child had brought him, listening with grave attention to some story about a bug, and looking. She struggled for the word every time she told it, looking undone. Like a locked room that a child had wandered into by leaving a door open that no adult had ever tried, because every adult knew better than to try. He didn't know how to be around her, Eloin said. That's the thing that got me in the end. He was 300 years old and he was clumsy with her. He didn't know the words. He'd never learned them because who teaches a monster how to talk to a child? He was learning. At 300 years old, he was learning something new, and it was that. And a man learning how to be gentle, you can't stay afraid of that either. Now the valley. The valley did not calm down as the winter wore on. It got worse, because a rumor with no ending eats itself, and by the deep of winter the story going around wasn't, the king saved a widow. It was, the king is keeping humans up there, and no one has seen them since, alive. Fear needs a shape, and if you don't give it one, it makes an ugly one. The elders of the valley, the council of old men who settled disputes and set the tithes, they got frightened. And frightened men in charge always decide the way to feel less frightened is to do something, whether or not the something makes any sense. They decided to march up to the castle and demand he give the humans back. I remember the day. It was the tale of winter, the light thin and gray, the river still frozen but starting to groan the way ice does when it's thinking about breaking. Maybe 30 men. Torches, though it was daytime, which tells you it was about the fear more than the light. Pitchforks and old blades. My uncle was among them, God forgive him, and Bracken, and men I'd known my whole life, good men mostly, frightened into something stupid. They wanted me to come. You saw it, boy, they said. You'll tell the king's men we know what he's done. I went, not because I agreed, because I was afraid of what they'd do without someone there who'd seen the truth of that night. I climbed the Black Hill for the first time in my life in the middle of a mob, sick to my stomach, and I have never been so ashamed of my own people. We reached the gate, the great iron gate of Ravenscourt that no one from the valley had passed through in living memory. And it opened. He came out to meet us himself, alone, no guards, no display, just the king in his long dark coat walking out through his own gate to stand in front of 30 frightened men with torches. That took my breath. He could have stayed inside. He could have sent the driver or ignored us, or, from what the story said, done far worse to 30 men foolish enough to come at him. Instead, he walked out unarmed and stood there, and he looked at us with that old tired patience, and he waited. The elders had rehearsed something, I think, a speech, demands, but standing in front of him, most of their courage ran out their boots, and it came out as a stammer. We've come for the humans," one of them managed. "Old Harl, the eldest. The woman, the children, you've no right to keep them. Give them back to their people." The king was quiet for a moment. "Their people," he repeated, and there was something under his voice, very cold, very controlled. "You are their people. We're the valley. They're of the valley." "They were of the valley," the king said. "On the night the valley's toll master gave them a heel of bread and turned them out to die in the snow because their deaths would be inconvenient to account for." His dark eyes moved slowly across the crowd, and they landed on Bracken, who went the color of ash. I know your face. You are the one who decided 3 lives weren't worth the questions. And now you climb my hill with a torch to demand I return the family you murdered by omission, so that you may feel like good men again." Silence, the dead, ringing silence of a mob that has just been named. "I did not take them from you," the king said, and now his voice rose just slightly, and it was terrible. "You threw them away. I picked them up out of the road you left them to die in. If you want them back, you must first explain to me why they should ever again be handed to people who feed them to the winter the moment they become a burden." No one answered. And then a small voice from behind him said, "Are these the bad men?" Wren had slipped out through the gate, 5 years old, walking a little unevenly on her heeled feet, and she came and stood beside the king, beside him, at his knee, one hand fisted in the fabric of his coat, and she looked up at 30 armed men with torches, and she was not afraid, because he was there, and she had decided a long time ago that he was safe. That did it. That, more than anything the king said, did it. 30 men looked at a child standing calm and warm and unafraid at the side of the monster they'd come to save her from. A child who leaned toward him when she saw the crowd, not away. A child who was plainly, obviously, undeniably fine, better than fine, healed, cared for, safe, standing in front of the people who'd let her freeze. You could feel it go out of them. The fear. The story they'd told themselves. It just went out all at once, the way a fire drops when the wood finally gives. Elowen came out behind her daughter, carrying the baby, and Bram was fat and pink and healthy, and she stood beside the king too, and she looked at the men of the valley with a look I will never forget. Not anger, something worse than anger for them to bear. She looked at them the way you look at people you've stopped needing. "Go home," she said quietly. "All of you go home. We're where we choose to be." Old Harl took his cap off. I remember that. This old man, this elder, took his cap off in front of the widow he'd have let die, and he couldn't meet her eyes, and he said, "We're sorry, Mrs. God as my witness, we're sorry." And they turned around and they went back down the hill, 30 men with torches burning in the daylight for nothing, and not one of them said a word the whole way down. I stayed. I don't fully know why. I was 14 and I'd started this whole thing. In a way, I was the one who ran to them in the road. Maybe I felt I had a claim on the ending. When the others turned back, I stayed rooted at the gate, and the king noticed. He looked at me a long moment. "You are the lantern boy," he said. "From the gate, you carried the little one to the fire." "Yes, my lord." "You did it correctly. Slow water, you saved her toes." A pause. "Where did you learn that?" "My grandmother, my lord. She said fast heat kills frozen flesh." Something almost moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. The distant memory of where a smile would go. "Your grandmother is wiser than the men who came up my hill today." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and he seemed to respect it. "Go home, lantern boy," he said, not unkindly. "But come back if you like. The little one asks about the fire and about you. She named you her friend. And then, quieter, almost to himself, she names people her friends very easily. It is a remarkable thing to be given so much for so little. I did not know people did that. And he turned and walked back through the gate with the family that was his now, in every way that counted, and the great iron gate closed behind them. I did go back, many times over the years. I want to tell you the rest quickly, because it's the part that made the old lantern keeper into a man who tells this story instead of one who lets it die. Aloan and the children never left. The valley, chastened, made a strange sort of peace with it. Over time, the old fear curdled into something more like awe, and then into something almost like pride. Our king, they started to say, as if he'd become theirs the day he proved kinder than they were. He came down the hill more after that. Not often, but he came. And where before people had scattered from his carriage, now they'd stand at the roadside and lower their heads, not in fear but in something closer to respect, and he'd nod back. And slowly, over years, the stitch between the two worlds pulled a little more closed. Wren grew up in that castle. She grew up unafraid of him her whole life, and I think being loved without fear by a child who grew into a woman who loved him without fear. I think that healed something in him that 300 years had worn raw. She called him, and this got out, and no one in the valley ever quite got over it. She called him Uncle. The king of Ravenscourt, Uncle. Aloan lived a long, good life in the high castle, and never once, she told me, did she regret waking up in that cold stone room. I went asleep in a ditch, she said, and I woke up in a fairy tale. Only the fairy tale was true, and the monster was the kind one, and the good people of the valley were the ones who left me to die. She'd laugh when she said it, but it wasn't really a funny thing, and we both knew it. And Bram, the baby, the one the king said, this child is not dead, Bram lived, grew up strong. And in time, when the old ways of the valley had softened enough to allow it, Bram became the king's steward, the living hand of the immortal house. A man who'd been carried up that hill, blue and silent in a shawl, running the affairs of the Lord, who'd fed him goat's milk drop by drop through a long, cold night. The child who was not dead, living proof, walking the halls of Ravenscourt for the rest of his days, that the coldest thing in the valley had once knelt in a ditch and refused to let the winter win. I'm an old man now, older than I ever thought I'd get. I keep the lantern still, out of habit, though there's a young one who does the real work and thinks I'm half mad. People come through the gate, and sometimes, if the night is cold and quiet and right, I tell them the story. About the white winter. About the widow who kept walking toward a village that wasn't there. About the carriage that stopped when it had never stopped before. They usually don't believe me. That's fine. I didn't believe it either, and I was standing in the middle of it. But I'll tell you what I've come to understand, in all these years of turning it over. We spent 300 years afraid of the wrong thing. We told ourselves the monster was the cold, pale creature up on the black hill. And the whole time, the real monster was smaller and closer and lived in every one of us. It was the little voice that says this person is a burden, turn them out, their dying will be inconvenient to you. That's the thing under the ice. That's the thing that almost killed Aloan and her children, not the king. The king stopped his carriage. That's the whole story, really. On the coldest night of the coldest winter anyone could remember, when every warm and living soul in that valley had decided 3 lives weren't worth the trouble, the one creature with no warmth in him at all was the one who stopped. So when the young ones ask me why I still light the lanterns, cold as it gets, old as I am, I tell them the truth. I light them in case someone's still walking out there in the dark, still trying, not lying down. Because you never know who's going to stop. And you never know, until the coldest night comes, which one of them you're going to turn out to be.